Now, this is not a prepared talk, in case you're worrying that I will read you to death. On the other hand, having survived for a good many, 66 years at this point, my memory isn't what it used to be. So my husband proceeded to outline for me some of the dates when I had been with Baba and where I had been, lest I forget while I was talking to you. And our next discussion was how many people, there may have been some of you who were down at the Southeast Gathering when I was there. I don't know. You might even remember where I left off there, because I don't. But I think the other evening we talked about it, and we thought that probably the closest we could come was after the accident in Prague, where Mother and I had flown out to Oklahoma and had visited there with me doing the laundry and feeding Meru, and Mother was running duty between everybody and the doctors and what was going on. And, I mean, it was just a horrendous scene there at the time, so I'm not going to go into all that. But Mother and I then went out to the West Coast to let the people there know what had happened, because there were lots of people waiting to see Baba. And then he had us go back to New York and deal with things there, and then I left New York and went down and stayed here at Yukon Dunes with Baba and the girls and everyone. And then we went up by train to New York, spent the time there for a while they all saw the doctors in New York. And then I went with Baba and the girls over to London. And Delia, I think, was with us. I can't remember who flew on the plane, but none of the mandali were there. And I just remember at that point, Baba was still in a big cast on his leg, and he was in the front of the plane at that time. And I was thinking, the young people here, there were a number of children on the plane, and all night long, Baba was exercising his leg with the cast on it, up and down, and up and down. You'd see it fly over the back of the seat and back down again. And these children, every once in a while, one would get up to go up to the powder room at the front of the plane, and all of a sudden you'd see them get next to Baba, and they'd stop. And then pretty soon they'd be over next to him, just staring at him. And the parents would come rushing down the aisle after a few seconds and say, "What are you doing?" Drag the children away. And a little while later, you'd see them again edge down the aisle and finally come again to look at Baba for a bit. And eventually we got off the plane in London and were taken to our hotel. And I remember it as being a very pleasant kind of family hotel, you know, lovely restaurant downstairs, but it was a very quiet, family-type place that seemed very safe. We settled Baba in his room, the girls in theirs, and I was down, I think, one floor from them. And I remember at some point there thinking that I just had to wash my hair. I had been driving and taking them back and forth and so on. I hadn't had time to do this kind of thing, so I went down and dunked my head in the sink, knowing full well as I did it that I would probably just get the soap on it and get well lathered before Baba would call me to go upstairs. So sure enough, finally, I got through the soaping, got that out, rinsed the hair, and bang, bang, bang on the door. Somebody came, "Charmian, Baba wants you." All right. Flew into a banker's coat that I had along, a purple one, Japanese style, long. Put a white towel over my head and a turban, flung it back, and in this very proper British old family hotel, I go running through the elevator and up and down the hallways to Baba's room. Charmian, Baba has everybody going out on errands, so no one will be here, and he wants you to watch the door for him so that he can rest and get some sleep. Yes, Baba, out in the hallway. There's no place to sit. I'm sitting cross-legged on the floor in this purple banker's coat. Everybody takes off. And it has to be kept quiet for Baba. Nobody's to make a sound. I swear to you, everybody in England came down that hallway during the course of that afternoon. I mean, we had drunks. We had people who were just absolutely impossible. And they were all greeted by this crazy American woman in her Japanese banker's coat and purple and the turban and going, shh, shh, running down the hallway at them, trying to stop them. Finally, after maybe 2 hours of this, it seemed like, at least to me, it might have been 5 as far as I was concerned, suddenly I began to hear this very strange noise coming from the bottom of the hotel, it seemed to me. It was a clanking sound. It sounded, for all the world, most like the ghost of Christmas past coming after Scrooge. And I'm listening to this, trying to figure out, where is it? I can't see where it's coming from, where it's going to enter this hallway. How am I going to shut it up? I can't find it. And it keeps getting louder and louder and louder. And eventually it gets up to where a door opens down the hallway, and out comes a man creaking and squeaking and banging with a huge wicker commode, which I later found out had packed in the tin under the seat an entire tea set unwrapped. So this is what was doing all the clanking and banging all the way up. And he was it had been sent for Baba, and it was to be taken into his room. And this man was absolutely determined he was going to get it there. And I'm trying to fend him and the wicker off. And we were having this wrestling match still with the turban and the purple coat in the hallway, trying to stop him from going into this room. And I finally got him to set the thing down and stop clanking away outside of Baba's door. And so then I was sitting there with this big wicker commode on the floor with the banker's coat with the turban. And still half of England running up and down the hallway, as far as I could figure out, all looking at this strange woman who was down there. And eventually, about then, people started coming back from their errands, and this whole parade arrived, and the door opened to Baba's room, and they called me in, and Baba, I mean, I could literally hear the laughter through that door this whole time. I mean, each one of these incidents as they take place. It was like I could hear him just cracking up. And so he asked them to please call me in, and I got in the room, and Baba has them tell me that indeed he had had the best sleep he had ever had. Such a wonderful rest. I said, so the next day, I remember we were sitting there, and Baba was holding the meetings with all the lovers that he had there in London, elsewhere, except for a few who came through the hotel that he had some business with at different times. And a lot of the time, we went out sightseeing with the girls. We took Mayra and Mani over to see, and Meru to see Madame Tussauds waxworks, for instance. And I can remember us trying to take Mayra through the waxworks. And of course, she wasn't allowed to be touched by any of the men or anything at that point. And so everybody, the girls and I, would join hands around her this way. And we're marching through the British Museum this way and trying to fend things off. We started up the staircase there at the waxworks. About halfway up, there was like a usher at a movie theater in uniform, little Johnny from Philip Morris or something. And he's standing there, and we're going by, and suddenly Mayra let out a scream. He touched me, you know, and everybody's having hysterics. The girls are all falling apart. We've done the wrong thing. And all of a sudden, one of us looked at him and went, he's wax. Calmed down again. And we kept on going through, you know, looking at different exhibits and so on. And every once in a while, you know, somebody would get interested in what was going on. You'd see them just kind of drop hands and begin to wander off, and everybody else is trying to tighten up to stop them. I mean, it's a big crowd in this place. But we got through successfully. We managed to avoid the chambers of horrors and things like that, but it was fun. We went over to Ham House and went through there. And of course, one of the problems that we had was that Mayra, of course, had been so badly hurt in the accident. And she had this whole huge patch torn out, from her forehead, and the bones, they were cracked, just like an eggshell had been banged all up through her head. I saw the x-rays at the time, right down through the eye orbits and into the sinuses. And at the time we were in Oklahoma, you couldn't even, she couldn't see through her eyes. They were so swollen, they were just purple. And they were very concerned that she not catch any colds, nothing like that. She had to have antibiotics the whole time we were there at the hotel. And this one night when we came back, we had been out to Ham House that day, and I think we went to Kew Gardens, and at some point at Ham House we had had trouble getting to the car, and it was raining, and they had brought Mara out on the porch, and we were very concerned about her because she was caught. Well, it didn't rain directly on her. It was out in the cold and damp, and we brought her back, and Baba all of a sudden called everybody in, and he was furious with all of us. How could you do this? Look at, Mara is dearer to me than my own heart, and you leave her to catch cold and so on. It just went on and on and on. And we were, of course, feeling very badly about this. And then finally, Mara left the room, and she said something, and she left. And it turned out that what had happened was she had refused to take her antibiotic. She didn't want her shot of antibiotics. So Baba did a whole trip on the batch of us to get her to agree to go take her antibiotic. And once she agreed, then all the fireworks were over. It was fine. But we didn't figure that out for another day. And one of the other things that happened there that I remember was the mandali got lost. We were in Baba's room one day, and the mandali were due in the next day at the airport at Heathrow. And I remember saying, just as I had said to Baba when we were here, I wanted to drive him when we went out to Oklahoma. I kept saying, Baba, can't I drive? I just had the feeling something was wrong. And I kept asking him, couldn't I drive the car? And he'd say, no. Baba, are you sure I couldn't drive you? No. This went on for one whole session. And he was getting more adamant about this each time, and that was when they had the accident. So this time I'm going, something is going to go wrong with this, I just know it. And he said, well, he was going to send the Becketts out to pick up the mandali when they came in. And I said, no, this isn't going to work. I can just tell it's not going to work. Baba, are you sure you wouldn't want me to go along with them to keep an eye on this? No. So I settled back, having been through this once, and said, all right, Baba, whatever you want, The next day came, and I came up from downstairs where I had had breakfast, and people were flying in and out of Baba's room. For heaven's sakes, what's happening? They've lost the mandali. What do you mean they've lost the mandali? They lost them at the airport. They couldn't find them. How do you lose 4 6-foot tall mandali? This is, when there's only one exit from the airplane. This is not. Well, they had missed them somehow. So everybody was sent scooting around London from place to place. Just go find them, so they would leave. And they'd run to the hotels. They'd run to where the interviews were. They went all over the place trying to find them. Got absolutely nowhere. Finally, somebody located them out at Delia's apartment near Kew Gardens, very forlornly going along there, and then brought them back to the hotel. But in the meantime, all morning long, while this was going on, he had I think Delia and me and Rano, and there might have been one or two others, depending on who was in or out at that time, and he was going from one to the other of us. Well, it's all Rano's fault. Well, it's all Delia's fault. We went through this endlessly for a very long time until we were like this, oh boy, wish they'd get here. So finally the elevator clanged down at the end of the hall, and I said, Baba, that might be them now. I think I hear them. And I went running out with his permission to go check, and came back 2 seconds later. That's them, Baba. They're coming down the hallway. So he said, all right, all of you, go away. So we went out in the hall. The mandali came in, and they filed silently into the room. The door shut. Rano and Delia and I are standing there out in the hall going. And there isn't a sound. Nothing is happening. And we're dying of curiosity. I mean, we're lined up against this wall like three little statues. And all of a sudden, the door opens silently again. And the mandali come out. And I mean, I've got to just show you this. They're oops, sorry, got it. If it's okay. And they're coming out this way. So we're looking at this and going, oh my gosh, what's happened? Sarosh, what happened? I mean, literally, with a sob in the voice. Baba says, it's all our fault. And there was a scene as the three of us literally fell on the floor, rolling with laughter. I mean, we were just screaming. So these men looked down at us like, you know, these women are insane. What has happened here? You know. So finally we managed to recover enough to stand up and explain what had been going on all morning. It's all Rano's fault. It's all Delia's fault, you know. So then they cheered up again. But you just never knew from one minute to the next what was going to happen. So we had an interesting time in London. Baba held a lot of interviews there at the hotel, and I wasn't part of any of that. One day we took everybody up to Oxford and then lost them on a mulberry up there, one of these things that you run around. Somehow they went one way and we went another, and Rano and I didn't know why, but at that point I had had a terrible cold. I had caught it when I was down here at Yupon Dunes, and I think it was around May 19th or something like that. I can't remember, but it was back in the spring that I came down with it, and it had just gotten worse with the flying back and forth and going around the countryside. By the time we got to Switzerland, during the latter part of the trip when we were over in Geneva, I was so ill that one day I finally went out and walked the streets trying to find a drugstore where I might be able to get some B12. I thought, well, maybe that'll allow me to at least survive. So, and I mean, I wasn't smart enough at that stage of the game to remember that Baba had said that one of the very best ways to burn sanskaras was to be ill, you know, that helped a lot. I thought, boy, did I have a boodle this lifetime. I don't know. But anyway, that cold went on all the way till Baba had left and I was up in Scotland. And I thought I'd killed myself one day because I went out sightseeing there up around Loch Lomond and so on. And it was one of these times in Scotland when it would rain fiercely, just ice cold, and then it would blow. And then finally you'd begin to dry out and the sun might come out for 2 seconds and then it would rain on you again. And after a day-long trip of that, I came back to the hotel thinking, I have now got pneumonia. I mean, there is no way I'm going to survive to get home. And with that, the next morning I woke up with no more cold than a rabbit. I was just fine. So, I mean, it was just one of those things that had to go on while I was with Baba that whole time. But this particular day in London, I was running a fever. And he had essentially brought me along to drive the girls and Mayra. And I said, Baba, could I please skip it this time? Because, I mean, my idea of hell personified at that point would have been to take Mayra in the car and have something happen to her while I was driving. Even if I did want to drive in Oklahoma, that was all right. But this was not functional. And I knew that my head wasn't working that well. So it wasn't too surprising that we got lost in Oxford, Rano and I. But I remember our coming back to the hotel that evening, coming into Baba's room, and he was laying there on the bed, and he said, do you notice anything different? And we looked at him, and went, you know, and he looked so disappointed, and finally he said, you don't see anything different? Why, no, Baba, what? And he pointed, and he'd gotten his cast off, which wasn't supposed to come off till at least in Switzerland. He'd been to the bone specialist that day. And you couldn't even tell he'd ever been in the accident. I mean, his leg looked like it was perfectly normal, just like the other one, because he had exercised it so fully and kept it so well that it was just in beautiful shape. And we went from from London, when the day came, we flew on down to not Geneva, the other end. Zurich, right. We came down to Zurich on a Swiss Air flight. And I remember Delia was always with her smelling salts and a handkerchief. You know, and that, and oh Lord, I was here. And we came in, and I remember getting into these big cars and driving over the Alps. And I remember going through all these little towns, and Goher kept saying, "What an advanced country. Such wonderful hospitals. Why, they're always the biggest building in the community." You know, she went on about this and on about it. It took a long time before it suddenly dawned on us that it was because of the Red Cross flag over the town halls. So we went on down from there to Locarno, where we stayed with Heidi Mertens. And Bob and the girls, and we were in one house that went around a big court, and then the men were over in another house nearby. And I just remember after we got in there, one day Baba asked me to make his tea. And I went upstairs. We had about 3 hours before it was tea time, 4 hours, something like that. And Haiti had a whole library full of wonderful old late 1800s novels, early 1900s, by Baroness Orczy and different people like that. So I was happily dug into these books there, having a ball and reading away. And at that point, I laid down on the bed to read. And about half an hour went by, and suddenly I hear Rano's voice outside, "Charmian." So I went out to the balcony, and I leaned over, and Rano said, "Charmian, Baba wants to know, have you fixed his tea yet?" "Well, Rano, it's only 1 o'clock. You know, I'll go at 3 and fix the tea when he agreed he wanted it." "Oh, all right." In went Rano. I went back, I laid down, I get about 10 minutes more into the book. "Charmian, Baba wants to know, have you started the tea yet?" "No, Rano, I haven't yet. I was going to start it at 3 o'clock so it would be ready at 4. "Well, all right." And Rano would go back to the book. 10 minutes go by. Rano comes back out. "Charmian, Baba said, will you please be sure to have the tea ready on time?" I said, "Yes, Rano, I'll have it ready on time." You know, and each time I'm getting just a little more burnt. Finally, the time comes when she comes out and says, "Charmian, Baba wants to know da-da-da." And I go, "Rano, I told you." You know, stopped dead in my tracks, and suddenly, and I mean, literally, it was like I'd been reamed out from my toes to my head suddenly. I mean, if a volcano full of lava had just gone through my head, and I stopped dead in my tracks and in mid-sentence and looked at her and said, "Rano, for heaven's sakes, I love you. What is this?" You know, because I adored her. I thought she was just a wonderful person. And immediately it was like my heart was full of love, and that was all there was to it. But it was like Baba took you through this reaming out process where the worst of all the scum came out. Whether it was your temper or whatever it was, it would appear. So then, you see, he was still not walking, really. But the doctors had him beginning to bear weight on this leg of his. So he kept complaining that they were putting him through Chinese torture. This was terrible. It was so painful. And this was this and that and the other thing. And the doctors kept trying to work their way through this. And finally, one of them went, "I know, he's putting his entire weight on that leg, and he's not supposed to do that." So they went and got books and balanced them very carefully with a scale and made him stand with the leg on the scale so that he couldn't put too much weight on it as far as they were concerned. Of course, at that point, they didn't realize that anybody with any paranormal ability could change the way the scale worked, but that was all right. It worked. I mean, Baba always let us kid him. And at one point, Irene Billow, had a rabbit that she had brought with her. One of the biggest rabbits I think I ever saw in my life, a great, big, huge white rabbit. And one of the children had the rabbit in their arms at one point and dropped it. And the rabbit broke its back, I think, as far as I could figure out. It was paralyzed from the waist down. So Baba is out doing this weight thing with the scale, standing against the wall with his hands on it. And they came flying out saying this rabbit had been hurt. And there was a scene as the doctors and everybody fly in with Baba saying, go, quickly, you know. We all ran in to see what was wrong with the rabbit and started trying to work on the rabbit. And I think for maybe 10 minutes we were in there struggling with this, and all of a sudden somebody went, Baba's still on the scale. You know, there was a scene as this exodus took place, running like crazy, and Baba was standing there very patiently. And they got him off of it and back into his chair, and then Irene wasn't there at the time. And so finally she came back, and Baba had her and the child come in very quickly and talked to the two of them, explained to Irene what had happened and so on. And the rabbit lived for, I think, a couple of years. Irene took care of it, or at least a year maybe, before it went. And it was funny, because almost every place I went with Baba, I brought him a rabbit. With Sparky down here, because we had gone into the airport to pick up my father down in Charleston. And we saw this place that advertised rabbits on the way into town. Stopped at this little farmhouse-looking place and met a very kind of rough old lady and asked her, did they have any baby bunnies? And she opened a hole under the staircase and reached in and hauled out of the black this little rabbit by the ears. And I'm standing looking at this little creature that she's got, and she looks at me and she says, now remember, this is an eaten rabbit, not a petting rabbit, you know. And we said, we'll take him. She said, all right, stuffed him into a paper bag, you know, took our $2 or whatever it was that we paid. And I think about a week later, the rabbit figured it, about a block further the rabbit figured it had gone to heaven, because we stopped at a produce stand, of course, and bought it carrots and lettuce and celery and whatever else we could find. And it wasn't any time before the rabbit was out of the paper bag being stuffed. And we went on out to the airport to pick up my dad, and I just remember sitting there with Sparky, who was reading some text on Hawaiian anthropology, as I remember. And there were a whole group of young men who were they were in the service, I don't know whether it was Army or Navy or what, but they kept coming up one at a time a little further across the hallway towards us, and then they'd go back and sit down. And then one of them came out and they said, I can't see anything, went back and sat down. I said, what are these men doing, you know? And all of a sudden it dawned on me that this bag sitting next to me was going. And they're trying to figure out what is doing this, you know. Finally one of them said, oh, dashed across the hallway, yanked open the top of the bag and looked at him. It's a rabbit. So apparently they'd passed bets as to what might be in there. So anyway, by the time we got back up to here to Myrtle Beach, the rabbit was laying on its back in my arm, you know, getting his tummy scratched, just having a wonderful time. So much for eating rabbits. And so we brought the rabbit over to Mayor Baba, who was there at the time with the girls, and he later on gave it, I mean, it had a lovely time with Mayor and Mani and the rest of them, and finally when they left, Baba gave it to Joe Chestnut, and it was in his farm for a long time. Again, rabbit heaven, a whole truck garden to look at and eat from, and Joe built him a pretty cage, and he just had a wonderful time. But eventually, despite the fact that Baba had said, don't lose him, he managed to get the door open, and there went the rabbit. So we don't know what happened. There may be little bunnies hopping around Myrtle Beach somewhere that came from that rabbit. And at the same time, we brought Baba a big jar of little minnows from down in the lake. And we had found a whole batch of little tiny frogs, about an inch big. And we had a whole jar of them, which we brought in and to him and the girls. And they sat he sat them on a little coffee table in front of where he was sitting. And then he had all of us come around. And these little frogs, literally, they built pyramids. They did leapfrogs over each other. They did put on a whole circus acrobatic act for him. I mean, it went on for like about 20 minutes. I couldn't believe it. And we were all just absolutely enchanted with them. So eventually we decided that was the end of the performance and went on our way, but back over to Locarno. We had been there for probably 2 days or something. And all of a sudden, Baba said, Charmian, I want you to go downtown and pick up Dr. Duncan at the American Express office. You can take Hades' car. I said, where is it, Baba? Out in the road there in front of the garages. Yes, Baba. So out I went. They gave me the key. I looked for a car everywhere. I couldn't see a car. I saw a child's toy. I did not see a car as far as I was concerned. So I went back and investigated some more. Come to find out that this, what I thought was a child's cart of some sort or something, was actually the car. It was a little Fiat Tipolino, which is the smallest car that's made. And it had 2 front seats and a luggage compartment. So, having had it totally confirmed that this indeed was a real car and that was the one I was to take, I climbed in, and I only knew one way to get down to the American Express office, which was to follow the railroad tracks, because I knew it was next to the railroad station. So I'm charging along any place I could see the railroad tracks. Suddenly found myself going the wrong way down one of these streets with a big, very beautifully dressed Italian policeman gesturing that I was going the wrong way down the wrong street. And he finally escorted me off to another place, and I'm tearing my hair out. We're going through all these gestures. And I finally got downtown over the cobblestones and pulled up in front of the American Express office and looked out, and I could see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ankles. I mean, that's all you could see out of the lower part of the feet. I'm going, that's more than Dr. Duncan. You know. Opened the door. In came Sarosh, Nilu, Adi, and Dr. Duncan. And the 3 of them crammed themselves into this little luggage compartment behind the 2 front seats, and the other one got in the front seat. And I mean, those are no small men. They're huge. So here we are, folded up in this little bitty car, and the car is about that far from the cobblestones. And we started up and finally drove back up to where Hades' house was, which was some distance, and at the end of it, it was uphill, and it got as far as the railroad tracks and went kafoo, and that was it. The car sat down. It was not going to go one more step. So fortunately, Gazella and her husband, Max, came running down and saw us there, got the men out. The men all went up to the men's house, and I think Max must have pushed it the rest of the way up to the house and got it settled. And we walked back and reported to Baba that we had accomplished our mission. But we went from there up on a number of very pretty trips up into the mountains. One of them, one day, Baba took us up to a place high in the mountains there, which was out on a big, had a big balcony area, or I don't know, not a balcony, but I mean it was built into the mountain. So there was a big flat area with tables and chairs, and we all stopped there for hot drinks and coffee or tea or whatever. And it looked down through a long valley. I mean, it was like the sound of music. You look down this long valley, and you could see Lake Lugano out beyond it, going off in 2 directions with the mountain again facing you. And there was an electric storm coming up the valley, which was down below us. So we were sitting on top of it, so to speak, and watching it with Baba there as it came. It was just amazing, just the most lovely afternoon. I can still remember it. One night we went down, they were going to have a big fireworks display. And we went up and parked on the edge of the mountains up above the lake and waited and waited. And Baba was almost ready to have us go home. And all of a sudden you could see coming in the distance this lovely big vessel, like sails outlined in lights, coming up the lake. And then they started floating little candles on wooden platforms out onto the lake, thousands of these little things. It looked like the sky had turned upside down. It was gleaming back at us. And then they started a huge fireworks display, which Baba seemed to enjoy very much. And that, of course, led me into trouble later on, because as we came here to Myrtle Beach at one point, I went, Baba just loves fireworks. And we were seeing fireworks displays all over the place coming down here. So we decided it would be fun to give Baba a fireworks expo. Right. And we'd do it out on the lake. So we went ahead, and I think they must have bought about a ton of munitions, it seemed to me. These were all lined up in the cabins waiting for this night we were going to do the fireworks. Baba had said yes, it was all right. And we loaded up the gondola. Well, first they were going to build a platform, and they were going to put it on stakes out on the lake. The platform was about this big. The first 1-pound salute rocket went off, and it went to the bottom. But at the time, they were going to put it on stakes, and then they discovered that the lake had a rock bottom, and there was no way those stakes were going to go in anywhere in that lake. And that's when they tried floating it, and as I say, that was it. So what we were left with was 4 of us out there in the gondola on top of all the munitions, and we had a little rowboat with us. And the rowboat had 3 cans with sand, coffee cans, and we were putting the fireworks into the coffee tins, lighting them and pushing. Quick, get the boat away from us, And the fireworks were going off this way across the lake, past the alligator's ears, And we're all sitting there, we're going to get killed. One of these is going to come into our boat. I mean, Baba, After about half of them were expended, we went, that's it. Shot off 1 more salute rocket, and we went back, and we discovered Baba had left about halfway through. And we figured it was probably to concentrate on keeping us alive out there. It was for sure we weren't doing a good job at it. But anyway, it was fun. And the fireworks stayed here for some time until I came down on my honeymoon in 1956, I guess it was, and finished up the last pictures of the area here that I wanted to get into the film. Because, I knew when Baba was here, that was not the time to fool with that. I could get them, subsequently or any time, pictures of the lake, pictures of the cabin, so on and so forth. If he was here, I was going to keep the camera on him. So, and you didn't have much of a shot with it because you had to run like crazy to get out in front of him to begin with. The cameras didn't have batteries running them. You had to wind them each time in order to, and I had the most advanced model out that there was. And you'd have to crank the thing up all the way to get it wound sufficiently. Then it would run for 1 shot. And then you had to crank it again. And by the time you had done 3 shots, your canister of film was through. And so I had 2 young men who would take turns carrying a huge bag of film with them. And I'd go over the heads of everybody, well, that one's done, and so I'd snap the thing out of the camera, the canister, hurl it over everybody, and they'd catch it in the background, in the meantime having fired one at me. And I'd catch it, snap it in the camera, and we'd go on, I'd crank it up to speed again, and we'd take the next shot. So, we did this every place we went for endless hours, chasing Baba, and you'd have to be going top speed in your track shoes as fast as you could because he never walked. He did walk, but everybody else ran just to stay behind him. It wasn't like get out in front. But if you were shooting film, you had to get out in front. So it was no wonder that I have trouble with my bones these days. Just from all the track work then. But in any event, the next time that I came down, Elizabeth said, well, please, you have got to remove the fireworks from the center because we're afraid of fires and so on. And I said I would be happy to do that. So we immediately drove over, picked up the fireworks, took them back to the Patricia. And we walked in, and we said to the desk clerk, we had a lot of fireworks, and we didn't know what to do. It would be fun to set them off on the beach, but on the other hand, we knew it was illegal inside the city environs. And so the young man at the bench said, at the desk said, "Oh, I can fix that." We said, "What do you mean you can fix that?" He said, "My father's the mayor." So a few minutes went by, and sure enough, he went ahead and fixed it, that we could set off the fireworks outside. They invited all the guests to come down and see the fireworks. Jay took them out, lined them up down the beach. At about then, he noticed a man come out in a uniform with 2 children with him, and he put the children in the chairs. And Dee looked at him, and he went, "That's the chief of police, I can tell." And so the man came down to where Jay was, and Jay said, "Well, wouldn't you like to set off the first fireworks?" He wasn't about to go try to do this himself without some backing, so the chief of police was down there. I remember with him finishing up the fireworks, and they were popping them off, and the children were enjoying them. And I just remember one lady looking at me sitting there, powder puff dowager type, and she said, "I thought fireworks were illegal here. Who are those 2 men down there setting them off?" And I said, "Well, one of them's the chief of the police, and the other one's my husband, and he works for the Department of Justice." This lady looked at me like she just lost it. That was it. But that was the end of those Baba fireworks. And as far as I was concerned, I didn't care if I ever saw another firework again. But anyway, that was just an enchanting evening that night in Locarno. And we stayed there on the mountain till quite late, right to the end of it, and just thoroughly enjoyed them because they were all going off under us over the lake. This beautiful display. Sometime later, Mara was not supposed, they were so afraid that she was just going to lose it with that huge sore spot that she had where the skin had been flapped loose from her head. But while we were in Locarno, she went to the doctor someplace there. I wasn't with her that day. And they came back just absolutely thrilled because it had healed. And the flap had closed down, so they knew it was going to attach and everything was all right. So, and they hadn't thought that would happen again for some time to come. So that was pretty exciting. And eventually, trying to think of some of the other things that happened there. I remember one day we drove from Locarno across to Geneva, and we stopped on the way at the edge of the road there, and we're going to have a little picnic lunch. And I just remember Delia and I and Rano going down. No, I think it was Rano and I went down and sat on kind of a break in the wall going down. Not a wall, but ground under the pine trees. And we waited for quite a little while before we started to begin to eat. And we had just about lifted our sandwich when Delia showed up on the top of the ridge and said, "Charmian, Rano, Baba says they have not started yet." He knew everything that we did. I mean, you couldn't get away with a thing in India or here. And he always was right there to stop you, fortunately, thank goodness. So anyway, we waited some more, and finally she came back and she said, "Well, Baba says to tell you they have started." So we went ahead and had our lunch, but I always remember it as a very pleasant picnic, but one of those times when you learn, well, you don't start anything unless Baba is already there, and it's all right. So we went on down to Geneva, and then it was like we couldn't budge. Mother and Dad had sent me money to see me on through my trip. Couldn't find it at the American Express. We went backwards and forwards. Baba couldn't get out. with the girls or anything. All the mandali were gone, but Duncan. They had had one of these fogs that just socked Europe in from one end to the other. They had had a big fire on the Ile-de-France, I think it was, so that they had several thousand passengers who couldn't get out and who were occupying all the hotel space around that they could find in Paris and elsewhere. And there we were in Geneva, and we couldn't get out. And days went by, and we would be, I was at that point kind of losing it, because on the one hand, here I was staying out at La Résidence. They were downtown at another hotel. In the meantime, my family had put me in the hands of friends from who one of whom was on the court in The Hague, and his wife, who were leading these very wonderfully worldly lives. I mean, visiting back and forth in these big chateaus, and you'd go for lunch, and you had the brandies and little things after dinner, along with the Methodist tract, which would arrive on the same tray. But that was at the Cartier's, the jeweler, and his wife. And his wife was just a darling. She was a little lady from St. Louis who had married him and gone to live in Geneva, and absolutely rebelled against the idea that she would ever have to speak French. They could all learn English. And they did. She's an amazing lady. I enjoyed them very much. They were very sweet. But anyway, as I say, so I was going from that kind of a world down to stay at the ashram environment of the hotel downtown with Baba. One day, I'm in the middle of a cocktail party or lunch or something. I just remember the phone ringing, and it was Delia, and she's, Charmian, Baba wants you to come right away. You're to go hunt for Duncan. They've lost him downtown. All right, Delia, I'd be happy to. Would you ask Baba if he wants me right now, and does he really want me to go just around downtown, or does he want me to find Duncan? Because if he wants me to find Duncan, then it would make sense to me that I take the chauffeur with me from down there who speaks the language. So Delia disappears, and a while later she comes back. Instant obedience was not my name. I'm sorry. I wish it was. I think it would have been so nice, but unlike many of them, I always had a after question that I had to ask before I could move. So anyway, Baba came back, sent back a message that indeed what he wanted was for me to find Duncan. They needed him then because they had gotten tickets out, and he had to be there. And he had gone for a visa into Pakistan. So we went down to, the chauffeur finally came, and I went down to one of the places with him, and every place you'd walk in, they'd say, he's not here, before we could hardly even open our mouths. So we finally got into some place, and I said, where do you go to get a visa for Pakistan? They don't have an embassy here. They said, well, you have to go to the British embassy. So we went down there, and sure enough, the first person we ran into was Dr. Duncan. We brought him back to the hotel. And poor Duncan had just been literally on day and night duty because, as I say, all the other men were gone. And he was exhausted. And I came in one afternoon, and here was Duncan. They had just sent him, Baba had sent him to his room to go rest. He should rest for 2-3 hours. I mean, everybody thinks you go to a master, you go to the avatar, you go to whomever you're lucky enough to draw on, and then everything's just going to be swell. Just lovely, you know. Get all those sanskaras lifted and calm. Well, it doesn't work that way. And Baba was quite clear about that, particularly with my mother, because after we had been down here in the barn and Baba had forgiven us for everything, we went back to New York, put the film together, and I'm taking the camera back to the projector back to the place where we had rented it. And I stepped out of the taxi cab with it, very pregnant with my first son, and there was a ditch. And I managed to put the projector down on the far side of it as I fell in, and fished myself out with a broken toe and knees messed up and the rest of it. And I went running on in with the projector, got rid of it, went out, got in the taxi on the other side of the building, and sailed down to my office. That was when I found out I had the broken toe and stuff. And my mother, with some reason, said, well, Baba, how come? I mean, here you've just forgiven us all our sins or whatever. And here's this child, she hasn't done anything. She goes to deliver this thing, and she falls into this ditch, breaks her toe, has to go through all this business. And I remember my OB talking to my other doctor who had gotten my toe put together and saying she wanted me down at her office right then, which was the other end of town. And the doctor said, well, but she seems fine. Why can't I just send her home? She said, I'm not concerned with her. I want to know about the baby. So down I went to her office and then finally home. But she said, how come? You know, how can this be? And Baba explained very carefully that the fact that he had forgiven us our sins or whatever had nothing to do with our karma, that we still had to go through it, that we still had to live out those sanskaras. I mean, he propels one faster through it, but it doesn't mean he takes them away. And he may also save you from some, you know, the outcome of some of it a bit, but the fact is you still have to truck through all that. And doing it faster leaves you, as Marshall said to me, Baba said in the latter part of his life that his mandali were all like rooms of broken furniture. I believe it. I believe it. So anyway, that where did I start that one from? I was going somewhere with it. Oh yes. So I came into the Baba's room there, and Duncan had been sent down to rest. And a few minutes later, he comes in, and he is just steamed. He is so mad. He's not. I'm leaving. I have had it. I'm going away. I am never coming back. And he starts literally to march out of the room. And Baba turns to Mani and Mara, and Mani goes, and she says, Duncan, Baba says, will you please wheel him back to his room? And Duncan wheels on his heel back to where Baba's chair is and takes him out of the room like nothing had happened. And I'm going, what happened? You know, to the girls and Delia. And she said, well, that apparently when Baba had sent Duncan to his room, what had transpired then was that then he sent Delia down to knock on Duncan's door about 15 minutes, 20 minutes later. Duncan, Baba wanted to know, would you like some newspapers or magazines to read to help you get to sleep? No, Delia, I'll get to sleep all right. Oh, all right, Duncan. Off she comes back. 15 minutes later, Duncan sends her down again. Duncan, Baba wanted to know if you would like to have half a glass of beer to help you sleep. No, Delia, just leave me alone. Well, about the fifth one of these, Duncan's reaction was, Delia, if you knock on my door one more time, I'll answer it in the nude. Now, wait. So, this was what occasioned this outburst as he came in to see Baba. He got dressed, he came back up, you know, and I'm leaving, I've had it. And I could hardly blame him. I mean, he'd been awake 24 hours a day for days. But in any event, he, as you know, did not leave. He went off to India with Baba and everything was fine. But I think most people had their moments here and there. We weren't all as steadfast as we might be 24 hours a day. But bless his heart, I just loved him. He was a wonderful man. I always remembered him from he's one of the early people that I had met. Him and Darwin and who was the other one? Looked a bit like Darwin even. There was another gentleman. Oh, Malcolm Schloss. But anyway, the days kept going by. Still couldn't get out. And then one day, finally, they managed to get their tickets together. The party got together, and off they went to Paris. And the day that Baba left, the chauffeur and I went over to the American Express office again for the 50th time trying to find my money order. And went in, and the man said, "No, not here, not here," as he's rifling through this batch of papers. I said, "Wait a minute, what's the pink one down there?" "That one?" "Oh, that's it." You know, I couldn't go till Baba went. That was all. I'd been with him. That was it. As long as you were with him, you were there. It wasn't like you could do something and he couldn't. That was for sure. So the day that he got to move, I got to get my money order, and I was able to go. And I went back on up to England, stayed with Delia for a few days, and then went up to Scotland on my own, got over my cold, went home. And that was the end of that trip. And then Mother saw Baba a couple, I think once or twice. She went on trips that she was there, and she only saw him for brief periods of time, but I didn't get to go on those. The next time I saw him was in 1956 when he came. And then we did the big trip around the United States, which is in the movie there. And Baba came into the Delmonico, and taking that film was kind of unbelievable. I had never shot a movie before. One Baby Brownie movie, I think, which Don had pushed me into taking in Switzerland, an 8mm. I went down and rented a little one, and I asked Baba if I could take a movie. And Baba said no. Finally, I said, "Don asked if I could take the movie, Baba." "Oh, well, if Don asked, then it was all right." So I went ahead and I took the little movie, a couple of little 8mm things. I mean, they're not big enough to even show on a screen, even if you could find a projector these days. But there was a sweet little movie of the girls, which we weren't allowed to show forever and forever. Not until recently could anyone have shown it, if then. And the other one was a little tiny movie of Baba sitting in his wheelchair dictating a message on his board to his lovers in the West. And I don't think we got the message off of it for years. I mean, it took concentrated work trying to figure out which letter was he pointing at. And it was like in Prague when he said, tell my lovers that their patient waiting will bear better fruit, when he sent us out to the West Coast to let them know that he couldn't come. And that was one of my real problems with his board, because that day I kept reading it, tell them that their patient waiting will bear bitter fruit, Baba? Bitter? We went through this about 5 times. Finally, better fruit. Oh, such a dummy. But normally reading for him went very easily. It was just that day I could not get that phrase. I just couldn't get it. It just didn't even make sense. But anyway, in 56 when he came, he engaged me to my first husband over at the Delmonico. And at that point, I think really there were 2 young men who had asked me to marry them, and he decided that I should marry Jay, which I did. And we had a stormy marriage that went on for about 8 years or so, and 2 sons later. And eventually, Baba had asked me to wire him when I thought, to stick it out as long as I could, and to wire him when I thought that it was not going to function any further, and I did, and he said, "Okay, you can quit now." And so we were divorced. Well, on one of the earlier trips, Baba had said that he could see that I would have 3 children. And he kind of made motions like there was one little one that would come to him, too. And I couldn't figure out, here I am divorced. I'm not about to have another marriage if I can possibly help it. Forget this. This is for the birds. But anyways, and when Baba had engaged me, he had given me his ring. He'd had Erish go in and get it from the room, and it was the ring that his family had given him when he came of age, I guess. And at the time, it was set in a big men's ring, very heavy ring, and it was what I would call a knuckle breaker for a girl. If you had shaken hands with anybody with that ring on, you would have wound up with 2 fractured fingers, one on either side, possibly the center one too. So I asked him if it was possible for me to take the ring apart and use the stone. Well, he wanted to know which part I wanted, the setting or the stone. I said, no, I was going to take the stone and have it reset in another one. I said, perhaps my husband would like to wear your ring, the setting for it. And Baba said, yes, that would be just fine. But he had a way of saying it where it was like he knew something I didn't know, and whatever it was just as cute as the Dickens. And it gave him a lot of pleasure. And there was just kind of a chuckle about it. So anyway, here I was divorced and trying to figure out what on earth was I going to do now. And one time, I remember back there, one day that was just particularly grim for me. I had a very bad time the night before with Jay, and in the morning I came out at one point, and the mail was laying on the table, and there was a magazine there. And I looked through the magazine, flipped it open. There was a picture of a sunny California hillside with the wild oats growing and wild California poppies. And it was something about the new generation or something. And anyway, there was a young man rolling down this hillside, just a blur of motion. And I had this feeling like I'd just been stabbed in the heart. And I just cried, and I cried, and I cried. And I mean, to me, it was like my life was over. Things had not gone well. And I'd never had that kind of joyous freedom or know somebody who felt that way again. So I kind of settled back and eventually, some years later, got a divorce, as I say, and then went, no way would I ever get married again. And several years went by, and a young man came, wanted to join the Sufis out there. And then over a matter of maybe 2-3 years, I mean, we became very fast friends. And the only time I think we had to talk over something, and I had gone over to his place in Oakland briefly at his invitation for dinner. He made dinner for me, and we were sitting there. Something came up, and I started to tell him about this story, about this magazine and the picture. This funny look came over his face. By then, we already knew we were in love. I mean, that was it. But he had this funny look. And he went off, and he came back up to the table with this magazine. And I looked at it, and I went, yeah, that's the one. And he opened it up, and he said, this picture? And I said, yes. And he said, that's me. So in 69, we were going to go over, to India. Everybody had their plans made. And we were thrilled to be going, and in the meantime, he asked me to marry him. And he asked Murshida if it would be all right if he married me. And Murshida said, of course. As far as I'm concerned, it would be, but I gave her to Baba years ago. So, Baba's the one you better ask about this. And in the meantime, don't talk about it, Juju. So then all of a sudden, Baba dropped his body. And we went, uh-oh. Now what do we do? So Mother said, well, why don't we just wait and see what happens when we get to India? All right, Mother. We got on the plane and off we went, a whole batch of us. And we were the first group that went over there. And we had been busily hunting up, little skits to do and songs to sing and whatever we could find, because we knew that at that point the mandali would be in distress over their loss. And we thought we had better do the entertaining if we could, if it would be helpful. So we tried to get prepared for that. And we arrived in India and got up to Pune, and the first night, Mother was called over to have a little meeting with the girls and so on, and they were sitting there talking. And so she told them that this young man had asked Charmian to marry him. And the next day, we all went over to Guru Prasad, and the morning went on, and the girls were there in the side room. And everybody bowed down to Baba's chair, and then we were singing in a little group, singing there at the end. And I remember Michael, my second son, who was a little boy at that point, wanted to bow down to the chair too. So he asked Duncan to help him, and Duncan went with him, and they did that. And then it was time to leave and go back over to our hotel or to the turf club for lunch. So we got out on the front porch, and all of a sudden, Mani came flying out and says, Charmian, Mara wants to see you. So I started to run into the building, and Duncan's going, Charmian, where are you going? I said, well, Mara wants to see me. Murshida wants to go. I said, I don't care. I'm going to Mara. You know, inside I went, and when I got up to Mara looked at me, and she said, Charmian, I want to know, do you believe that Baba was really here today? I said, you betcha. She said, you know, all those years ago, Baba told me that I would know his own when they came to him. And after he was gone, you know. And she said, I always wondered how this could be. And she said, was that young man who was helping Michael there the one who asked you to marry him? And I said, yes. And she said, well, I want you to know he's one of Baba's old friends, and that Baba is very happy about this. So then I went, now how do I tell Duncan this? Anyway, Murshida said, you got to, so of course I did, but we've been happily married for some 26 years since, I think, and of course had our own little girl too, Mary, who came along to bring a little joy into our lives. It's funny, all these years went by. I had this funny name, Charmian. I always wondered, what does that mean? You know, where did that come from? People are forever asking that. Where did that come from? Well, it came from a poem that Mother read one time when she was being a contact editor on the Old Century magazine. And there was a poem to Charmian Unborn, and that was where she got the name. But just the other day, my youngest son called me up, and he said, Mother, I know what Charmian means now. I said, Michael, what does it mean? He said, it means a bit of joy. It was so funny because all those years ago, I kept thinking, you know, there's really nothing that you can ever give to God. Just nothing. I mean, nothing that he hasn't given you beforehand. But then it occurred to me that there was one thing that you might be able to give to God, and that was to remember to try to be joyous no matter what happened, and to be able to smile no matter what happened. At least it might make other people feel better, whether it made you feel better or not. So that always seemed to me great fun, and to find out that that was what my name meant was just a delight as far as I was concerned. That seemed to be lots of fun.